Dust Bowl disaster of the 1930s is one of the most significant environmental catastrophes in American history. Imagine waking up one day to find the sky pitch black as if night had fallen in the middle of the day. It wasn't a natural occurrence like an eclipse. It was the result of massive dust storms that could reach terrifying heights, sometimes more than a mile into the sky. These storms carried thousands of tons of dirt and debris across the landscape, suffocating everything in their path. The Dust Bowl, which ravaged the Great Plains, was not a singular event, but a series of devastating dust storms that occurred over several years, starting in the early 1930s. It was a time of extreme hardship for farmers and communities already struggling with the impact of the Great Depression. In fact, many families living in the heart of the Great Plains were hit with one disaster after another. First, an economic collapse that left them in poverty, followed by a severe drought that turned fertile farmland into a dry, cracked desert. The drought was the first blow. With little rainfall, the soil began to dry up, making it harder for crops to grow. The region, which had once been rich with farmland, began to show signs of stress. But it wasn't just the lack of rain that made things worse, it was the way the land had been treated. As the demand for crops increased, especially wheat during World War I, farmers turned to new farming techniques and technology, such as tractors and mechanized plows. While these advancements allowed farmers to cultivate more land, they also disturbed the delicate balance of the ecosystem. The deep-rooted grasses that once held the soil in place were uprooted, leaving the earth exposed and vulnerable to the harsh winds of the plains. By the time the first major dust storm hit in 1931, the land was a ticking time bomb. Winds would blow across the flat landscape, sweeping up the loose topsoil and carrying it for hundreds of miles. The dust clouds, sometimes miles wide, would choke entire towns. The dust didn't just stay in the air, it settled everywhere, blanketing homes, farms, and crops. For people living through the Dust Bowl, it wasn't just the economic struggle or the lack of food that haunted them, it was the constant threat of suffocating dust storms. As the dust storms intensified, they became known as black blizzards, because of how dark and thick the sky would become during these storms. The dust was so heavy that it would block out the sun, and residents would often have to light lamps during the day. The storms were so fierce that they could strip the paint off houses and bury entire buildings in dust. The dust itself wasn't just a nuisance, it was dangerous. Breathing in the fine particles of dirt could lead to respiratory issues, and in many cases it caused dust pneumonia, a deadly condition that claimed the lives of many. In some cases, the storms would last for hours or even days, leaving families trapped inside their homes with little protection from the suffocating dust. For those who tried to escape, the environment outside was no better. The air was thick and choking, with visibility reduced to nearly nothing. The dust storms made daily life nearly impossible. Children couldn't play outside, crops failed, and even basic tasks like cooking and cleaning became monumental challenges. This was the beginning of the Dust Bowl crisis, a period of despair and destruction that would go on to affect millions of people. As farmers struggled with crops that wouldn't grow, many were forced to abandon their lands and homes, fleeing westward in search of better opportunities. But their journey was not an easy one. In part 2 of this story, we'll explore the human toll of the Dust Bowl disaster, as families struggled not only with the environmental devastation, but with the social and economic challenges that came with it. As the dust storms grew more intense, the devastating impact of the Dust Bowl was not limited to the land. It began to tear apart the lives of the people who lived there. Farmers and their families had already been struggling with the effects of the Great Depression, and now they found themselves facing an environmental disaster that seemed impossible to overcome. The crops that once fed their families and provided income were now nothing but lifeless husks, the soil beneath them reduced to dry, barren dust. The human toll was immense. With crops failing and the soil eroding away, many farmers found themselves unable to provide for their families. Desperate for a solution, some turned to the government for assistance, but help was slow to come. By the time the storms hit full force, it was clear that life as they knew it was no longer possible for the people of the Great Plains. Families who had farmed the land for generations were forced to abandon their homes and livelihoods. The journey to find new opportunities was long and grueling. The roads leading out of the Dust Bowl were lined with families and old cars, often filled with nothing more than the clothes on their backs and a few meager belongings. These refugees became known as Okies, even though they came from all over the affected states, including Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado. They were searching for a better life, but they were often met with hostility and resentment. In the early stages of the migration, many of the refugees hoped to find work in the agricultural fields of California, which was seen as a promised land for those seeking refuge from the Dust Bowl. However, they quickly realized that the golden opportunity they had dreamed of was out of reach. In California, they found competition for jobs was fierce, and the work that was available was often low-paying and difficult. Migrant workers were not welcomed with open arms. Locals viewed the influx of refugees as a burden, taking jobs and using up already limited resources. The conditions that the refugees faced in California were nothing short of dismal. Many of them had no choice but to live in makeshift camps. Sometimes in the most squalid conditions, these camps were overcrowded, with little access to basic necessities like water, sanitation, or healthcare. Disease spread quickly in these conditions, and the dust storms that continued to haunt them in the Great Plains followed them to the west, further degrading their already precarious situation. In addition to the physical hardships, the social toll was equally devastating. The migration of so many people caused significant social strain, with communities in California and other states struggling to support the large number of displaced families. Tensions rose, and the refugees found themselves alienated, often treated as outsiders, or even blamed for the economic struggles of the local population. The Dust Bowl not only displaced people, but also destroyed the way of life that had been established for generations. Entire towns in the Great Plains were abandoned, as the residents left in search of a better future. Schools closed, businesses shut down, and once bustling communities became ghost towns. The land that had once been rich with crops was now a vast wasteland, leaving behind nothing but memories of a time when the Great Plains had been a hub of agricultural prosperity. While many of the refugees managed to make new lives in other parts of the country, others never returned to the land they had lost. The Dust Bowl had not only caused environmental devastation, but also led to the breakdown of entire communities. Families had to come to terms with the fact that the land they had cultivated for generations was no longer capable of sustaining them. By the mid-1930s, the federal government began to recognize the full extent of the disaster and took some steps to address the human toll. The government created programs to provide temporary relief for migrant families and encourage them to relocate to other regions with better farming opportunities. These efforts, however, could not undo the psychological scars that had been left by the experience. In Part 3, we will look deeper into the environmental damage caused by the Dust Bowl and explore how the devastation of the land led to the further degradation of the lives of those affected. The story of the Dust Bowl is not only about the land, but also about the resilience of the people who had to adapt, survive, and rebuild in the face of one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in American history. As the Dust Bowl progressed throughout the early part of the 1930s, the environmental destruction began to spiral out of control. The Great Plains, which had once been fertile and lush with crops, had become a barren landscape. What had once been a sprawling agricultural region, home to wheat, corn, and other crops, was now being slowly devoured by wind and dust. The impact of this widespread soil erosion and desertification was nothing short of catastrophic, not only for the land itself, but for the livelihoods of the families who depended on it. One of the primary causes of this environmental catastrophe was the failure to recognize the delicate balance required to maintain the soil. For years, farmers had been plowing the land with little regard for sustainable practices. The introduction of mechanized farming equipment, such as tractors, made it easier to cultivate the land, but also led to the destruction of native grasses that once held the soil together. With the grasses gone and no proper crop rotation or other soil conservation techniques in place, the earth became loose and vulnerable to the wind. As the drought of 1931 to 1933 gripped the Great Plains, these factors combined with record-high temperatures to create the perfect storm for dust storms, or black blizzards, to form. When these storms occurred, they would whip through the air at speeds of over 60 miles per hour, often rising up to 1 mile high, carrying dust and debris for hundreds of miles. The dust was so thick that it would turn day into night, and people would be unable to see more than a few feet in front of them. These storms were not just inconvenient, they were dangerous. With every storm, the topsoil, which was once rich and fertile, was blown away. The crops that remained in the fields were suffocated, unable to grow in the thick layers of dust that covered everything. The winds did not just tear through the fields, they tore at the very essence of the land, eroding the topsoil and leaving nothing but a dry, cracked surface beneath. Once proud farmland became wasteland, incapable of sustaining life. The environmental toll was not just on crops and soil, It also severely affected the wildlife of the Great Plains. Animals, such as birds and small mammals, either fled to other areas or died from the lack of food and shelter. The region's once thriving ecosystems, which relied on the moisture and balance of the land, began to disintegrate. The air quality also suffered as dust storms released particles that made breathing difficult and even dangerous. Respiratory illnesses, such as dust pneumonia, became widespread, particularly among children and the elderly, who were most vulnerable to the polluted air. For farmers, the collapse of their land felt like the loss of everything they had worked for, everything they had built their lives around. The cycle of dust storms and crop failure dragged on year after year, creating a sense of hopelessness. In many cases, it was not just the financial losses that devastated families. It was the emotional and psychological toll of watching the land that had been home for generations turn against them. Entire towns were abandoned. As the once thriving agricultural hubs of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado became ghost towns. The land that once yielded crops now seemed to curse those who attempted to farm it. The government's slow response to the disaster made the situation even worse. During the early years of the Dust Bowl, there was no coordinated effort to address the soil erosion or offer any aid to the devastated farmers. It wasn't until the middle of the 1930s that the government took significant steps to try to mitigate the damage. But by then, the worst effects had already been felt. The environmental destruction caused by the Dust Bowl not only changed the landscape permanently, but also set the stage for a broader reevaluation of farming practices across the United States. The lasting impact of the Dust Bowl's environmental devastation was felt long after the dust storms subsided. The region was left scarred, with many parts of the Great Plains experiencing continued soil degradation. It took years of concerted effort to restore the land to some degree of fertility, and even then, the lessons learned from the Dust Bowl would have a lasting influence on agricultural policy and conservation practices. In Part 4, we will explore how the government's response to the Dust Bowl finally began to take shape, and how these efforts helped to rebuild the region and shape future agricultural practices. The lessons learned during this time were crucial in preventing similar environmental disasters from occurring in the future. However, it was the resilience and determination of the people who lived through the Dust Bowl that made the most lasting impact. By the mid-1930s, the effects of the Dust Bowl were becoming painfully clear. Entire regions of the Great Plains were left devastated, and farmers were struggling to survive. However, as the worst of the storms began to subside, efforts to rebuild and recover began to take shape. One of the most crucial turning points came in 1935, when the federal government took decisive action to address the environmental crisis. Recognizing that the Dust Bowl was more than just an agricultural issue, but a national disaster affecting thousands of people, the government began implementing significant changes. The creation of the Soil Conservation Service in 1935 was a key response. The service was established to teach farmers better land management techniques and help restore the land. They introduced measures such as crop rotation, where different crops were grown in sequence to prevent the soil from losing its nutrients, and contour plowing, a method of plowing along the curves of the land to reduce water, runoff, and prevent erosion. In addition to these agricultural policies, the government also focused on providing direct relief for the displaced families who had become known as Dust Bowl refugees. The Resettlement Administration, created in 1935, aimed to relocate struggling families to new lands where the soil was fertile and less prone to erosion. These resettlement programs offered loans to farmers and provided support for relocation, giving many families a chance to rebuild their lives and livelihoods. But the recovery wasn't just about planting new crops or moving people to new lands. It also involved large-scale efforts to reforest the region, with trees planted in rows to act as windbreaks. The Shelter Belt Project, which started in 1934, aimed to create a green barrier of trees to reduce the impact of wind erosion on the soil. More than 220 million trees were planted across a 2,000-mile stretch, stretching from the northern part of the Great Plains down to Texas. The planting of these trees helped stabilize the soil and protect the remaining topsoil from being swept away by the winds. As these programs began to take effect, the environment slowly started to recover. Farmers, equipped with new knowledge and tools, were able to restore the land to some degree. By the late 1930s, many of the dust storms had diminished and crops began to grow again. The efforts of the government and the resilience of the American people allowed for a gradual but steady recovery. although the effects of the Dust Bowl would continue to be felt for years to come. The Dust Bowl's impact didn't just end with the soil restoration efforts. The disaster led to significant changes in the way agriculture was practiced in the United States. Farmers were now more aware of the importance of conservation and sustainable farming methods. The Sarna for Farm Security Administration also supported programs to encourage more responsible farming with a focus on long-term soil health and water conservation. The Dust Bowl left lasting scars on the people who lived through it. The emotional and psychological toll of losing homes, farms, and loved ones was immense. For many, the journey to rebuild their lives was a long and difficult one. However, it also fostered a sense of unity and perseverance. The Dust Bowl demonstrated just how fragile the balance between humanity and nature can be, and how important it is to take care of the land that sustains us. In the end, the Dust Bowl wasn't just a lesson in the dangers of environmental mismanagement. It was a lesson in the importance of proactive government intervention, community resilience, and environmental stewardship. The policies put in place to combat soil erosion and restore the Great Plains helped shape the future of American agriculture. And while the disaster of the Dust Bowl is now part of history, it remains a stark reminder of the power of nature and the importance of respecting the land. Thanks for watching. If you found this exploration of the Dust Bowl interesting, be sure to check out our other videos on environmental history and natural disasters. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think we can learn from the Dust Bowl to prevent similar environmental disasters in the future?